You cancel your own plans the moment someone asks for help. You do not think twice. You just go. And afterward, something strange happens. You feel good. Not merely relieved, useful, needed, almost worthy. From the outside, this looks like generosity. Sometimes it is. But sometimes, helping carries a second purpose. It does not only solve another person's problem, it temporarily settles the question of your own value. What happens to your sense of worth on the days you have nothing to give? Psychologists Jennifer Crocker and Connie Wolfe call the broader mechanism contingencies of self-worth. Their model begins with a simple idea. Self-esteem can rise and fall with success or failure in the areas on which a person has staked personal value. For one person, that area may be appearance. For another, approval, virtue, competition, or achievement. Usefulness is not a separate category they named. It is one way this mechanism can appear when approval, competence, and moral goodness become tied to being the person who helps, fixes, performs, or never becomes a burden. That distinction matters. Helping is not evidence that something is wrong with you. Ambition is not a diagnosis. Caring for people is not a pathology. The problem begins when contribution stops being something you choose and becomes the price you believe you must pay to remain acceptable. How does that association form? There is no single origin that explains everyone. Temperament, family roles, school, work, culture, and relationships can all shape it. But for some people, one pathway begins with conditional approval. Parental conditional regard is the psychological term for giving or withdrawing affection and approval depending on whether a child meets an expectation. A 2023 meta-analysis by Jolene Haynes and Nicholas Schutte combined results across 31 samples. Greater parental conditional regard was associated with more contingent self-esteem, more behavior driven by internal pressure, more depressive symptoms, and a weaker sense of connection. Associated does not mean destined. The research cannot look at your childhood and declare exactly why you became who you are. It does show that repeatedly experiencing approval as conditional can make self-worth feel conditional too. The lesson may never have been spoken. It may have arrived through patterns. Attention became warmer after achievement. Conflict became quieter when you were easy to manage. Being responsible earned recognition. Having needs created tension. A child can interpret those patterns as a rule. When I am helpful, successful, calm, or undemanding, closeness feels more secure. Carl Rogers described a related idea as conditions of worth. In his person-centered theory, people can learn to accept themselves only when they satisfy certain standards. Rogers offered a clinical framework, not proof that every adult struggle begins in childhood, but the framework captures the inner logic clearly. Acceptance begins to feel earned rather than given. Years later, the rule may still operate, even when the original setting is gone. You answer the phone at 11 at night, although you are exhausted. You accept the project no one else wants. You solve problems before anyone asks. On a quiet Sunday, rest does not feel peaceful. It feels suspicious. Why can such small moments carry so much weight? Because the decision is no longer only about time or effort. It has become evidence in a private trial. Saying yes supports the case that you are dependable, good, and worth keeping. Saying no risks producing guilt, not necessarily because you harmed anyone, but because you violated the standard on which your self-respect depends. Self-determination theory gives this pressure a more precise name: introjected regulation. It means acting under an internal demand, such as guilt, shame, or the need to prove yourself. The pressure now comes from inside, even if its rules were learned elsewhere. You may look highly motivated, while feeling very little freedom. That is the trap. The behavior can be admirable while the engine behind it is punishing. Research on performance-based self-esteem shows why this matters beyond childhood. In working adults, tying self-worth to achievement has been associated with burnout and exhaustion. The association does not mean every committed worker will burn out. It means performance becomes more psychologically expensive when a result is also being asked to certify the value of the person producing it. Crocker and her colleagues demonstrated the same principle in another setting. Graduate school applicants whose self-worth depended more heavily on academic competence showed larger rises in self-esteem when accepted and larger drops when rejected. The rejection was still a rejection, but when competence carried the weight of personal worth, the outcome reached further into the self. This may explain why a small mistake can feel like a verdict on your character, or why being unable to help someone can feel less like disappointment and more like exposure. The event says, "You could not do this." The contingency translates it into, "You are less valuable now." There is another cost. When you repeatedly present yourself as the person who never runs empty, other people may learn to interact with the role rather than the whole person. This does not prove that they are selfish, and it does not mean you caused their neglect. It means relationships adapt to repeated patterns. If you always offer and rarely reveal need, some people may never learn how to meet you anywhere else. Then being indispensable creates a particular loneliness. Everyone knows what you can do. Fewer people know what it costs you. So how do you tell chosen contribution from fear-driven usefulness? Pay attention to what happens when you imagine not helping. Chosen contribution can include effort and sacrifice, but it still leaves room for preference, limits, and refusal. Fear-driven usefulness makes refusal feel like a moral failure. It does not merely say, "I want to help." It says, "I need to help so I can remain the person I am allowed to respect." The way out is not to become cold, passive, or unreliable. It is to loosen the connection between performance and human worth. That may begin with a small pause before an automatic yes. What am I choosing? What am I afraid this person will conclude if I decline? Would I judge someone I care about by the same standard? It may include allowing trusted people to see a need before you have converted it into a service. It may mean receiving help without immediately repaying it. It may mean treating guilt as information about an old rule, not automatic proof that you have done something wrong. Research on self-compassion offers one useful direction. Self-compassion means responding to your own difficulty with kindness, perspective, and recognition that imperfection is part of being human. It does not require declaring yourself exceptional. More importantly, it does not make care conditional on winning, performing, or being useful first. None of this cancels an old pattern in a single moment, but it creates new evidence. You can set a limit and remain connected. You can make a mistake and remain a person. You can contribute because it expresses your values, not because it purchases your right to belong. Look at your life again. Somewhere in it is a highly capable version of you who appears whenever there is a problem to solve. That version may have earned praise, protected relationships, or helped you navigate difficult environments. It deserves understanding. It does not deserve permanent control. You cancel your own plans the moment someone asks for help. The real question is no longer whether you can be useful to them. It is whether you can remain valuable to yourself when this time you choose not to go.